and welcome back to UbiPsych, where I see psychology everywhere. It's been a really long time since I made a video, and I'm sorry about that. With my very busy schedule of Satan and Baphomet worship, it's just impossible to find time for videos sometimes. And we all know how that is. As anyone who supports trans people, you know, we obviously worship Satan and Baphomet, and we have to make a lot of time for that. If you think that's some sort of joke, well then you don't spend as much time watching right-wing YouTube videos as I do. I watch the right wing, the left wing, and everyone in between because I'm not really political myself, and I like to see all the opinions. Before I get started, I want to remind you of the context here. This is a non-political channel, and I'm not involved in politics, which means I don't carry a bias of needing to express any views that are consistent with an overall platform or those of my friends or my echo chamber. I just simply follow science, psychology, and the new information that I find. The reason that my videos on trans have come across as supporting the community is because that's what the science says. And while I want to treat all people with respect, if the science said something different, I would have a different opinion. So it's really important to understand that. I also want to encourage anyone who's here to comment below. I read your comments, and to this point on this channel have not once ever deleted a comment. I don't plan to do so unless you say something just beyond the pale. And I read almost all of them and respond to any that I can that make an argument. If you want to leave an insult as well about me or trans people, feel free, because we all know what that means. It means you're upset and have no counter argument. So it's kind of a little trophy every time I see an insult in the comments. What I want to talk about today requires us to peel away a few layers that often get in the way of these conversations. One is terminology or semantics. We often hear people saying, if they don't support people in the trans community, there are only two genders. We're going to try and avoid that sort of thing coming into our conversation today at all. If to you the word gender just means sex, to some people it seems to be just another word for sex. If that's the case, then sure, I'm not sure why we would need another word if it means nothing different than biological sex to you. But if that's what it means to you, then sure, there's only two, with rare exceptions. If what you are talking about is gender identity, which is strictly inside someone's head based on their beliefs and based often on biology and biological differences, but things that we can't observe without scientific instrumentation, then you have to admit that by default, there aren't just two. Even within males and within females, there's an incredibly broad range of the way people feel and how much, say, they identify with typical males and typical females. I myself am a cisgendered male. However, I don't identify with all the things that are typically male. Sometimes I say, well, you know, 80 or 90% of the time, yes, I fit into the norm on that. But on others, I say, it clearly doesn't describe me. And so that by its very nature means that there is a spectrum of gender identity. I would say I'm almost entirely male in the way I think, act, and interpret the world, and the way I want others to treat me. I like to have male pronouns. I like the assumptions that come along with my being male most of the time. Some people are more 50-50, but not enough to say that they feel transgender in any way, just that, hey, you know, I don't fit very well to my sex or gender in the way I think or the way I wish I was treated by the outside world. And so I just want to move us into the realm, not to end the conversation or to say that anyone's right or wrong about it, but just to say here today, we are talking only about that which is undeniably the psychological truth of a person. And we're going to tackle the topics of, are these beliefs delusions? And are the way people are treated consistent with how you should treat someone if they do have delusions or hallucinations or something like that? If you are offended by my mere suggestion of this, please stick around. I'm not suggesting that there is anything disordered happening here. I do not believe that transgenderism is a disorder of any sort. But if we open our minds to that possibility, it allows us to discuss this a little more completely, and that we can ask questions like, even if it is, are the way people are treated appropriate? And the answer ends up being no. So it's a way of saying, hey, even if you're fully right on this one issue, there's more to the discussion. So let's get into this a little bit further. Let's say, just as an example, to lay out something that we can use as a not particularly difficult or controversial example, something that is often perceived as having a gender difference, and also could become something that we would call disordered at its extremes. And what I want to use as that example is competitiveness. Now, competitiveness is one that I'm choosing for the following reasons. It is believed to have a gender difference, both biologically as well as socially. It is possible that it's more driven by one of those or entirely driven by one of those, but that's not what we're here to debate. Just that in general, we find more competitiveness among males than among females, whether it's socialization, biology, or probably a combination of both. I also chose this one because it's one where I don't really align with the male norm. On lots of things I do, on this one I don't. I tend to be very under-competitive, and so I find myself to not be a perfect fit. And I want to analyze this as an example, and we're going to discuss the idea of psychological disorder and what that might look like in terms of this one element of thinking and personality, and go from there.
Let's look at competitiveness, which is said to have a gender difference. You don't have to believe that it has a gender difference, and certainly we're not sure how much of that is biological and how much of that is from socialization. But in general, it's a good example of something that we think of as having a gender difference, yet it's not super controversial, like types of intelligence or things like that. So if we look at competitiveness, we could discuss this in a psychological context. When we want to know if something is disordered, we would usually ask two basic questions. Is it unusual, and is it harmful? Now, that is an oversimplification of how we make this decision, but in general, it's fair to say that meeting those two criteria is a pretty good guess at what would be considered disordered. If you look at this example, you can see that I've marked on the right and left what we might call extreme or unusual scores beyond the red dots. In these cases, we would say this is certainly unusual and not the way most people experience competitiveness. On the low end, this would mean that you don't find yourself to be competitive, maybe you don't care if you win or lose, and you don't enjoy competitions. On the high end, it would mean that you see competition or seek competition everywhere, and you care immensely about whether you win or lose. So, that's unusual in either case. Now, is it disordered? Is it harmful? Well, it could be in either case. If being too far on the low end caused you to be apathetic or just plain not fit in society and find yourself out of place, it could be considered disordered. It's a little easier to see how the high end might be a problem because being hyper-competitive could lead to dangerous situations, high stress, and other things. But if that's the case in either one, we might actually be able to say that being too competitive or not competitive enough could actually be considered disordered. But another way to think of it is to consider that we believe there's a gender difference in competitiveness. If that's the case, it's something on which you could feel like you identify with the other gender. So this is again just hypothetical data, as was the first one, just to make a point, as it shows how many things are distributed and how we think of them. It could be just about any behavior or personality trait or any of these things. If we look in this case, we can see that males have a higher average than females. But you could easily be what would be unusual for a male, such as, say, 4 or 5. About 4 would be pretty unusual, and 3 very unusual for a male, but very typical for a female. Again, this may not be true, but let's say that it is. This would be someone like myself. I'm not very competitive. And I am aware that my level of competitiveness may be more typical of females than of males. I can imagine that if in every aspect of my life I found this, I might identify as more female. In my case, there are very few of them and not enough to cause me to feel like I identify as anything but male. And I just notice these exceptions where, yeah, most males are way more competitive and into sports and being in a competition, caring more about winning and more upset about losing than I am. Similarly, a female who's highly competitive might find that they are more like a male. In this case, it's not only something we may notice as a difference, but we may wish that we were treated differently as a result. Perhaps we would wish that we were invited to more or less competitive activities, or invited to things that are less competitive when we don't get that invite, and things along those lines. So it does create some social distress in some cases. You could even argue that this is then a potentially disordered thing if you are just outside of your gender's norm. While it doesn't have that same sort of harm or disorder type of feeling as those who are wildly competitive, or incapable of understanding or participating in competition, it could be the case that because it causes you stress or causes others to view you differently, and often worse, or as odd, that, yeah, you could call it a disorder to some extent. However, we can't say it's the same as the other extremes from the first slide. So here we would just notice that it's possible to align with the other gender, although really somewhere within the expected distribution for your biological sex.
After that example, I'd like to bring a few things to your attention. First of all, notice that when we talked about the possibility of it being disordered to be outside of your gender norm rather than outside the human norm, there are two ways to reconcile that. One is if you yourself thought differently, or the other one is if you weren't treated in a way socially that made this a problem. So what makes this unique to, say, mental illness is that it can be treated socially, so to speak. And again, treated, please don't get upset if you're thinking of treated, that means it's a disorder. We're entertaining the hypothesis that it is a disorder and even assuming that it's true for the sake of conversation. So that would make this unique to other things, that it's highly socially treatable, and that in a world of complete acceptance, the disordered part of it would disappear. That's unique. And I know I, for one, would be happy to participate in a social solution to other mental issues if it existed. If it was that simple, just to treat someone a little bit socially differently, it can so much improve their mental health. I'd be happy to do it in most cases. I don't want to be compelled to do it. I'm not a fan of compelled speech at all. But I would choose to because I'm nice. In addition, as we look at that information, we can see that there are many other things that are like it. So I used the not particularly controversial example of competitiveness, but that would also apply to things like clothing even. You could say this is sort of what's in the normal spectrum and what's outside of it. And so it's a useful illustration of sort of the myriad things that someone might notice there's a mismatch on and lead them to have a different identity than what's expected. So I want to engage further in this exercise. So we're going to assume essentially that transgender identities are a mental illness. I do not believe that. Please just let your guard down. Let's say that it is. And what I want to do is demonstrate that the way trans people are treated is still wildly inappropriate, even if that were true. And it helps us to expose some of the ways along the way that it doesn't really make sense to treat it as a disorder. The first we've already talked about, which is that if it's really just a clash between identity and social issues, then it's different than most other things. Let's assume, as our examples, let's use schizophrenia and depression as examples of what everyone accepts are mental illness. I'm choosing those because they're highly difficult to deal with, highly stigmatized, and in the case of schizophrenia, we can assume that there's a likelihood of delusion and hallucination, which people often attempt to equate with trans identities. So just quickly, let's describe those. So in depression, we know that people have lower mood and tend to have more negative thinking. We also know that they may have some thoughts which are actually just wrong, right? Some feelings of hopelessness that don't reflect reality, some feelings of gloom and doom and everyone dislikes me, everyone looks down on me, that can in fact be wrong and misinterpretations of the world and border on being hallucinations or delusions, and that they're held beliefs that just aren't true. But we know also it's biological in most cases, could be somewhat cognitive, but that it's a difficult thing to deal with, and one that can be social in nature as well to some extent. Now thinking of schizophrenia, I'm using that because while not all people who suffer from schizophrenia have delusions or hallucinations, it's a common feature of that, and most people think of it as an automatic and built-in feature. So we're going to use that to say that's again something that's typically very, very biological, and we can see is a brain disorder, but also then does result in real hallucinations or delusions, the seeing, hearing, or imagining of things that just aren't there, and to see, does that line up? Okay, so when someone says acknowledging someone's transgender identity is supporting or agreeing with their mentally ill misunderstanding or hallucination, they are wrong, and here's why. They are telling you about the observably true part of the problem, if we call it that, which is they say, hey, the way that I think, the way that I feel, the way that I wish I was looked at upon others, the comfortable clothing for me, all happens to align. And this is the case where, you know, you do fully fall into the other sex. You could be somewhere in between, but they align with the other sex. Therefore, it will make me feel better and reflects my factual psychology, which is a combination of biology, experiences, etc. If you treat me in this way, it doesn't cost you anything. And I'd appreciate if you do that. The equivalent of that in, say, schizophrenia is not the hallucinations they're having. It would be that person coming to you and saying, I have schizophrenia. I hate to use sort of just a silly example for something so serious, but it's easier if I do this. So I'm going to say, let's say that this person with schizophrenia hallucinates clowns, and that these clowns are often out to get them or scary. Let's say they just asked you, hey, could you do me a favor and not mention clowns around me whenever possible? I understand you're human and it might happen, but if you think about it, you know, please don't hire a clown for the office. Don't hang a clown poster where I have to work. That would be great. They're basically telling you the factual part of the situation, which is, this is who I am, how I think, and you can help me with it. And any sane, nice person would say, of course, I'll try. And we would do that. A depressed person might say the same thing. Can you try and reduce the negativity around me? It would help if you were more explicit in talking to me and things so that I don't assume the worst. You're not obligated in either of these cases, any of these cases, to do this for the person. But gosh, in the case of mental illness, we certainly don't go, screw you. I'm not going to do that. I've never seen anyone do that and say, this thing, since it's in your head and not in reality, I'm not going to in any way acknowledge it. That would be the same as saying that the actual other disorders are also completely non-existent because they do exist in that person's mind. Psychology is real in that way, and they could all be treated the same. So now, if the schizophrenic person that you're interacting with actually hallucinates a clown down the hallway, no, it may not be good to pretend that you see it too, and no one's encouraging you to do that. In fact, it'd be better to say, no, I don't see it, and attempt to help them resolve reality with what they're seeing. But the only equivalent I can see in that would be someone who's trans actually insisting that you pretend you see different biological features or things that you don't physically see. And I don't see very many. I'm sure there's someone on the extremes asking for that. But that would be the equivalent, is to actually say, I literally believe I have different parts or chromosomes than I have. No one's saying that. I don't know a single person who actually says that. They know exactly what equipment they have. They know exactly what their chromosomes say, and that in fact those chromosomes are in every cell. But by whatever chance of genetics and all the hormones and things that happen in utero and as children and all the experiences we have somewhere, this has resulted in the fact that their brain functions and their experience of the world is that of the gender opposite their biological sex. And so they have a gender identity, a factual gender identity that is of the opposite sex, and they ask you to help them with that. So it's true in this case that they may not be able to prove to you, although there's some evidence, plenty in my videos and in literature, showing that transgenderism has roots in real biological differences, the brain structures and things. But again, let's assume the worst case scenario, that it's strictly 100% imaginary in the mind of a trans person. Assume that for a moment. And imagine if you looked at them and said, I understand that what you wear and how you'd like me to interact with me and your view on the world is based on something that only you believe and you can't prove to me. And so, therefore, I reject it. And I'm going to ridicule you for wearing what you wear, refuse to interact with you in a way that is consistent with who you are. That just sounds mean to me, but especially the hypocrisy is so deep if you yourself are religious. Do you wear something around your neck or on your head or something that covers part of your body because of your religion? You know, something that you believe that you can't prove to be true to anyone else? When I interact with anyone doing any of those things, not once in my life have I said, you silly insert religion here. How could you wear that when it's not true, dummy? And I'm not religious. Even in my mind, that's exactly what I think is happening. They're wearing it because of the commandments of an invisible creature. But I'm only willing to say that here in this video because it's important to explore. I will not say that in my home, on the streets, in an office, in any public space, because it's rude. And I know that it makes their experience of their day and their life worse. I don't need to do that to them. Will I debate them in the right forum? If they're my close friend, would I maybe even encourage them to have a more rational approach to life and maybe reject the woo in their life? Possibly. And I think if you have that sort of heartfelt conversation with someone that you know about any topic, you can get away with that. But to pretend that someone who offers to you a factual statement about their identity, which is more provable than, say, a religious belief, although certainly not 100% provable, observable, or something that can be evidenced, you reject it, refuse it, and ridicule them. There's not much more to say on that other than you're being a bad person. You're being a bad person, and you know it. And maybe you feel like you're actually doing it because the way they're acting does violate your belief system and these sorts of things, and so maybe you're gaining some sort of internal consistency to do that. Well, that's something you can handle in other ways. Don't associate with people who are different in that way. Give them some space. But to outright ridicule them and deny them those things, I mean, to deny someone their pronoun in this case is like for me to say, oh yeah, you know, I knew about your religious beliefs, but when I ordered the catering for this, I didn't get you anything special. Because while I know you don't eat pork, that's based on something in your mind which isn't real. And since I don't believe it's real, you've got pork. You can take it or leave it. We don't do that. It's interesting, as a side note, to how the religious side of this is catered so universally. We allow for this, something that is always not provable and simply a belief. So, you know, as much a delusion or hallucination as anything else could be. But yet, if you go on an airplane or go to a public event, it is easier to have that catered to than an actual food allergy. The person with a food allergy, a biological problem, will find a minefield of danger in these situations. Whereas the thing that you can't evidence is completely acknowledged. If you hold those beliefs and then look at other people for holding beliefs that also can't be proven and treat them poorly for it, it's hypocrisy. It's pure, inarguable hypocrisy. I want to round out this conversation by reminding you that this is a non-political channel and none of my beliefs are fueled by a political angle. In fact, if we get into this more, I have pretty balanced views on this. I am concerned about how to handle young children who have gender confusion. The hypersexualization of some of the children in those cases, that stuff concerns me quite a bit. And normalizing this for adults is something that I think we need to do. For children, I think it's very, very difficult territory, and I'm not sure what to do there. I also don't believe in compelled speech, and I often express extreme caution when considering things like surgery and things like that. It's always up to the person, but do I think it's always a good idea? No, I'm not necessarily someone who just says, be you, go for it, because there are risks and downsides, and I have very balanced views on these things. Not to say I don't have biases, we all have biases, but I hope I provide a unique perspective here because I'm not coming from a left, right, or religious, or I am myself transgender sort of position, and I like to think it makes me more objective. If you don't think so, tell me why not. And ultimately, here's the most important thing. What I think is key to everyone's happiness is self-determination. And what I want to be is a champion of that, and to point out that some aspects of self like this that are being suppressed by others are harmful. And I will be right there to protect you and your self-determination when it comes to things I don't believe in, like your religious beliefs, even your political beliefs. That is the most important thing, is self-determination and respect for that self-determination, because it is so incredibly linked to happiness. And that's really what I would say is my goal as a non-religious person and a non-political person, is simply maximizing happiness for you, me, and everyone else. One last thought here. When I say self-determination is something I want to protect for all of us, think a little bit about how this situation could be reversed and how I would absolutely stand by you and protect you from this. If you notice that I laid out religion as one example, but there are many others where we respect people's decisions to be who they want to be and believe what they want to believe. And rather than confronting that in daily life, we let it slide and we give each other the respect to determine themselves. And you also will notice that I said the reason that being trans can be difficult and even damaging is largely social. So that would mean anything that conflicts with the social surroundings would be labeled as disordered potentially. One example of that? Well, I just laid out what the norm is, which is to respect other people and to have the empathy required to give them that self-determination. Those of you who single out certain belief systems and deny them that empathy could be seen as outside the norm and painted as yourself disordered. It would fit the exact same mold. Maybe not outside the entire human norm, but outside the cultural norm. Telling you that you're outside the Overton window, the accepted thought, the accepted way of acting, and you yourself get labeled as disordered. I'll be there to protect you from that, just like I'm here to protect trans people from this false accusation. If you like this, please subscribe, leave a like, or suggest something for my next video. Thank you.